Why trying to practice non-attachment is basically a recipe for frustration, resentment, and weakness. So why I'm making this video is because I see quite a lot of people fall into this trap, and I fell into it myself in my early 20s. And oftentimes this concept is nothing more than escapism repackaged under a kind of a glorified new packaging system that gives, a boost to someone's identity because it's quote unquote spiritual or evolved, or it's different than or an alternative to whatever it is that they may have been brought up or raised in. So it provides some basic sense of like novelty and stimulation that is of course very attractive to to our identities. The real issue is that it's a concept that is completely misunderstood and completely taken out of context. And why this is problematic is because as humans, we tend to understand new concepts within the context of what we already know. And if what we already know is dysfunctional and completely irrelevant, then obviously understanding something new in terms of that context would obviously be a recipe for failure. So what I mean by dysfunctional or completely irrelevant, meaning you're not raised in the culture that that concept comes from. You didn't grow up in a monastery where that concept is actually from and should be practiced and was meant to be practiced under specific and very precise guidelines and circumstances. Also, usually why people would get into that concept to begin with in the first place is because they feel some sense of life being off or being unsatisfactory or basically some form of dysfunction or discomfort. And personally, I believe there's a kind of empowerment that comes from truth and integrity, basically by saying what you mean and meaning what you say, and then having your beliefs and your actions kind of line up with that. And then it seems clear to me that living your life in the opposite manner, not saying what you mean, not really meaning what you say, and maybe not even realizing that you're doing that, and then obviously not having your actions and your beliefs even remotely resemble those things, it's obviously that that would make someone weaker and more or less prone to a lot of frustration and resentment. So a great example that I can give to illustrate what I'm talking about here is basically like if I stub my toe and it really hurts, maybe it's even bleeding, but I'm going to pretend like it doesn't hurt and just try to move on with my life. It doesn't matter how much I try to pretend that it's not there or try to just suppress the experience of it, it's still there. I'm still reacting to it. And by me trying to not react to it, I'm just reacting to it because it's a real thing that's there in reality. Like I'm speaking right now into a microphone. So if I was like pretending like I wasn't speaking, that would obviously be kind of schizophrenic and just really quite odd. And honestly, I think that's a really great way of understanding how most people understand and practice the concept. As in, like, I experience something that bothers me, so I'm gonna externally and even internally try to pretend like it doesn't, or that it is something different. Or people will get into like I'm under control of my thoughts, so I can choose to react differently to this thing. And it's like, yeah, externally you might have the choice whether or not to blow up in rage or blow up in a reaction. Of course, we have hopefully some degree of basic regulation skills, but we don't have choice in the fact that we're already reacting to the thing and we're having to process it. It's like if you're walking late at night and someone comes up behind you and grabs your shoulders or yells at you or makes a loud noise and your body freaks out and is startled, you don't have a choice in that. That happened, that occurred. Maybe you have a choice in if you want to like turn around and punch them in the stomach or run away or hug them or whatever that might be in the circumstance. You might have that bit of a choice, but even that is kind of a lot of a bit of a stretch, and is really a lot of mental gymnastics have to take place to really make that to be a thing. So then if I stub my toe, maybe it's going to hurt tomorrow, but if I'm practicing all this non-attachment or whatever, it still hurts. It's still there. It's still a thing. I'm still reacting to it. But now I'm just kind of lying to myself. Or maybe I'll just try to be aware of it or just do mindfulness, but like not externally express the pain because that would be, bad in this basic circumstance. But in reality, both responses are forms of denial, deceit, and ultimately confusion. The pain is there. The event occurred, and just pretending like it doesn't exist or trying to do something different is just, again, a lot of mental gymnastics, a lot of mental tension, and ultimately a deep form of self-deceit. But just imagine the level of confusion, deceit, and weakness that this would engender on actual personal and emotional examples, meaning genuine, impactful life experiences or different relationship dynamics that obviously we're having some reaction to. We want to pretend like we don't. But then just imagine if that is becomes your response to things, and that becomes your a big piece of your identity because you're spiritual or evolved or conscious or mindful or whatever fill in the blank terminology. Ultimately what you're doing is kind of lying to yourself and then probably lying to other people and just being ultimately quite confused and probably on a crash course to undermining your health and really making yourself weaker overall. And from what I've seen over the 15 years of being in this industry, it seems like long-term spiritual people tend to fall into a couple basic categories. On one end is kind of like pretty switched off and kind of lackadaisical, kind of stoner-esque, and then kind of just a bit limp, almost like a spaghetti noodle. Like I know it's like a weird example, but just when I look at people, when I meet people like that, that's the kind of quality that I get back from it. It's just kind of like amorphous, and just like there's really nothing there. And usually those people have a lot of digestive issues, a lot of immune conditions, and are not physically very vital. Um, but on the other extreme, there's kind of the more rigid, uptight people that are typically full of a lot of false pretense because they're interpreting so many important events through the kind of mindset that I explained just earlier. And then they tend to be mentally quite tense as a result. And then there's another flavor of that, which is just the people that are just really full of resentment, anger, and frustration. So people get really like deep into conspiracies and deep into the world doesn't understand me and I'm so different and no one can um, understand my experience and I'm so special and I can't live in the world because it's so messed up. So I have to go do something else or whatever other kind of extreme example of that. So, anyways, hopefully that makes sense and kind of illustrates in kind of silly examples, I know, but basically, if you just translate it over to like emotional and psychological things that people are basically doing the same exact thing and then living their life that way, I hope it's clear and a bit obvious as to how that might be problematic and how that might lead to frustration, resentment, conflict, and overall becoming a weaker, less effective, less comfortable human being.